Why did they all lie about how he died? The official report said heart attack, natural causes, a quiet end for a quiet man. But standing 30 feet from the grave, watching four old warriors drop brass cartridges onto her grandfather's coffin, Catherine Hayes knew the truth was written in blood. And she was about to prove it with 187 confirmed kills and a promise she had no intention of breaking. December in Montana doesn't forgive. The wind cuts like a blade. The sky hangs low and gray, pressing down on the mountains, making everything feel smaller, colder, more final. Snow had fallen the night before, covering the cemetery in white, making the world look clean, pure, nothing like what was really happening. She stood apart from the mourners, always apart. That's how they had trained her: observe, analyze, never let emotion cloud judgment, never let anyone see what you're thinking. Her face showed nothing. No tears, no grief, just stillness. The kind of stillness that makes people uncomfortable because it seems inhuman. But it wasn't. It was control. The kind of control that comes from knowing if you let even one crack show, everything inside will pour out and drown you. Four old men formed a circle around the open grave. Dress uniforms, medals catching the weak winter light, backs straight despite their years. These weren't just veterans, these were warriors. The kind who had fought America's wars for 4 decades and buried more friends than they could count. The old guard, that's what they called themselves. Not officially, just between them. In the quiet moments when they gathered to remember what they had been and what they had done. Victor Hawk Kine stood at the north point. 67 years old, still built like the Marine sniper he'd been. Face like weathered leather. Eyes the pale blue of high-altitude ice. He'd been her grandfather's spotter in Desert Storm. Had watched his back through some of the worst fighting of that war. Had carried him 2 clicks under fire when shrapnel tore through his leg during the retreat from Kuwait City. Brothers in everything but blood. Colonel Marcus Webb stood to Hawk's right. 68. Silver hair. Distinguished in that way only career military officers can be. He'd commanded the unit Ironside served in during the Gulf War. Had written every commendation that filled her grandfather's service record. Had sat at his table every Christmas for 40 years, drinking whiskey and telling stories about the men they'd lost. Sergeant Major Tom Bradley was next. 65. Thick through the chest. Hands that looked like they could still break a man in half. He'd been Ironside's squad leader in the early days before either of them had any rank to speak of. Had taught him everything about surviving in combat. Had cried only twice in his life. Once when his daughter was born. Once when he got the call about Ironside. Master Chief Pete Sullivan completed the circle. 69. The oldest. Walking with a slight limp from the knee replacement 2 years ago. Navy SEAL. 3 decades of service through Grenada, Panama, Desert Storm, and a dozen other conflicts that never made the news. He and Ironside had worked joint operations more times than either could count. Had saved each other's lives so many times it stopped being remarkable and just became what they did. The honor guard folded the flag with mechanical precision. 13 folds, each one carrying meaning that civilians would never understand. The flag was presented to Margaret, Ironside's daughter, who sat weeping quietly in the front row. She was 54 and looked like she'd aged 10 years in the week since her father died. But Kit wasn't watching her mother. She was watching the old guard, studying them. The way Hawk's jaw tightened when the first shovel of dirt hit the coffin. The way Webb's hand trembled slightly when he saluted. The way Bradley kept glancing at the tree line like he was checking for threats that weren't there. The way Sullivan's lips moved in what might have been a prayer or might have been something else entirely. They knew something, all of them, something they weren't saying, something hidden behind the official story of heart attacks and natural causes. The ceremony ended. Mourners drifted away, heading for their cars, heading for the reception where there would be food and drinks and stories about the man they'd lost. But the old guard didn't move. They stood in their circle, waiting until everyone else was gone. Then one by one, they reached into their pockets. Tom Bradley went first. He pulled out a single rifle cartridge, brass casing, copper jacket. the kind of round Ironside had used in his M40 sniper rifle during Desert Storm. He held it up so the others could see, then dropped it into the grave. It landed on the coffin with a soft thump that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Pete Sullivan went next. Same ritual, same cartridge, same soft sound as it hit the wood. Marcus Webb, then Hawk. 4 bullets for 4 brothers. A tradition they'd started after the Gulf War when they buried the first of their number. A promise that they would remember, that they would honor what their fallen brother had been. No words were spoken, none were needed. Kit watched all of this from her position 30 feet away. She'd learned young that distance provides clarity, that standing too close makes you part of the emotion instead of the observer. Her grandfather had taught her that, along with 1,000 other lessons about how to survive in a world that didn't care if you lived or died. Hawk was the last to turn away from the grave. As he did, his eyes found hers. They locked for just a moment. In that moment, she saw something that made her breath catch. Not grief, not sorrow, fear. Hawk was afraid. And Hawk had faced down Iraqi Republican Guard, had stared through a scope at targets who could shoot back, had walked into firefights that should have killed him a dozen times over. Hawk didn't fear anything. Except maybe what Kit might do next. Their eyes held. Then Kit turned and walked away, disappearing into the tree line like a ghost. She wouldn't be at the reception. Couldn't be. Didn't do well with crowds. Didn't do well with emotions. Had learned to control herself so completely that sometimes even she wondered if she felt anything at all. But she did feel. God, she felt everything. That was the problem. The stillness wasn't the absence of feeling. It was the containment of feeling so intense that letting it out would destroy everything. She wasn't cold. She was a bomb, and the fuse was already burning. What she didn't know yet was how far back the story really went, how deep the roots of betrayal ran, how many men had died for secrets that should have stayed buried. But she was about to find out, because 3 days after the funeral, someone tried to kill her. And that's when everything her grandfather had trained her for would finally make sense. What does it take to turn an 8-year-old girl into a weapon? Kit remembered the first lesson like it was yesterday. She'd been small for her age, all knees and elbows, hiding behind the door of her grandfather's ranch house while the old guard gathered for their annual reunion. She'd been watching them with an intensity that seemed impossible for a child, taking everything in, missing nothing. Ironside had noticed Hawk looking at her, had smiled that quiet smile of his. "She has the eyes," Hawk had said. "I know," Ironside had replied. "Same eyes your grandfather had, same eyes mine had." The eyes, that's what they called it, that ability to see what others missed, to read a situation in fractions of a second, to know where the threat was coming from before it arrived. Some people are born with it, most aren't. But the ones who have it, the ones with the eyes, they're different. They see the world not as it is but as it could become, every possible outcome playing out simultaneously in their minds. Kit had the eyes, and Ironside recognized it immediately. The training started the next day, not with guns, with stillness. He'd take her into the woods before dawn, make her sit in one spot for hours, just watching, learning to control her breathing, learning to become part of the landscape, learning that the world reveals its secrets only to those patient enough to wait. "What do you see?" he'd ask. At first she'd see nothing, trees, rocks, sky, but Ironside would point out the subtle things. The way the birds stopped singing when a predator moved through the underbrush, the tracks in the snow that told stories of who had passed and when, the broken branch that indicated someone had been careless. The world was full of information if you knew how to read it. By the time she was 12, she could track a deer through 3 miles of forest, could tell you what it had eaten, where it had bedded down, whether it was injured or healthy, could predict where it would go next based on wind direction and available cover. Same principles apply to humans, Ironside had said. Just more complicated. Humans lie, humans hide, but they leave tracks just the same. You learn to read those tracks, you'll always know what's coming. The rifle came later. She was 14 the first time he put the weapon in her hands, not a child's rifle, a real one. The same M40 he'd carried in Desert Storm. Heavy, unforgiving, requiring strength she barely had. "This isn't a toy," he'd said. "This is a promise. Every time you put your eye to that scope, every time you put your finger on that trigger, you're making a promise. You're promising that the shot will count, that it will matter, that it will protect someone who needs protecting or stop someone who needs stopping. You break that promise, people die. Good people. People who trusted you to make the shot." She'd understood even then. Understood that this wasn't about hunting deer or punching paper targets. This was about something bigger, something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The first year she could barely hit the target at 200 yards. Her arms shook from the weight of the rifle. Her breathing was all wrong. Her trigger pulled jerky and inconsistent. Ironside never got frustrated, never raised his voice, just corrected, adjusted, taught. "Breathing is everything," he'd say. "Your heart beats, your blood pumps, your body moves even when you think you're still. You have to learn to time the shot between heartbeats. In that fraction of a second when your body is as close to still as it will ever be, that's when you pull the trigger, not before, not after, in that perfect moment of balance." By 16, she was hitting targets at 600 yards with consistency that made even the old guard take notice. By 18, she was making shots at 800 yards that veterans with decades of experience couldn't match. By 20, she'd outshot every Marine sniper Hawk could find to test her against. "She's better than you were," Hawk had told Ironside one night, sitting on the porch, drinking whiskey under the Montana stars. "I know," Ironside had replied. "She's better than any of us ever were. That's the point. Each generation is supposed to be better than the last, supposed to learn from our mistakes and not make the same ones." But there was something in his voice when he said it, something that sounded like guilt, like regret. Kit had heard it even then, standing in the doorway where they couldn't see her, listening to the conversation she wasn't meant to hear. "You think she'll forgive us?" Hawk had asked. "When she finds out what we did, what we're asking her to become?" "I don't know," Ironside had said. "I hope so, but even if she doesn't, it won't change what needs to be done. The world needs warriors, Hawk, real ones. The kind who will make the hard choices. The kind who will take the shot even when it costs them everything. Kit's that kind of warrior. Whether she forgives us for making her into one doesn't change the fact that she's what this country needs." Kit had gone back to bed that night with more questions than answers. What had they done? What were they asking her to become? What shot would cost her everything? She wouldn't understand until much later. Wouldn't understand until she'd made her first kill at 23, serving in a unit that officially didn't exist, taking out a terrorist leader in Yemen from a distance the target thought was safe. Wouldn't understand until she'd felt what it was like to watch a man drop through her scope and know that she just ended a life, ended all the possibilities that life might have held, good or bad. That's when Ironside's words made sense. Every shot is a promise, and every promise has a cost. By the time she was 32, she'd made that promise 187 times. 187 confirmed kills across a dozen countries in conflicts that would never make the news. 187 lives ended by her hand. 187 families that would never see their sons or husbands or fathers again, because Kit Hayes had put her eye to a scope and made the shot. She told herself they deserved it, that they were terrorists, war criminals, threats to innocent people, that each one she killed meant lives saved somewhere else, and mostly that was true, mostly. But there were nights when she'd wake up seeing their faces, when she'd remember the way they'd dropped, the way their bodies had jerked when the bullet hit, the way the life had gone out of them in an instant like a switch being flipped, and she'd wonder if Ironside had woken up the same way, if he'd carried the same weight, if he'd questioned the same things. She'd never asked him, and now she never could. Standing in the Montana woods 3 days after the funeral, Kit felt the weight of all those questions pressing down on her. The reception had been yesterday. Speeches and tears and people telling stories about what a great man William Ironside Hayes had been, how he'd served his country with honor, how he'd been a hero. No one had mentioned the 8 men who died in Iraq. No one had mentioned Operation Phantom. No one had mentioned the truth that Ironside had carried to his grave. Kit had known about it for years, had found the file buried in his personal effects when she was 25, home on leave between deployments, had read the after-action reports, the testimony, the investigation that went nowhere because the men who knew the truth were all dead or loyal to the lie. Her grandfather had made a mistake, had called in a strike on coordinates he thought were enemy positions, had been wrong. 8 Marines had died in the blast. Good men, men with families, men who trusted him to keep them safe. The official record said it was the fog of war. Mistakes happen in combat. No one was blamed, but Ironside had blamed himself, had carried that weight for 15 years, had spent every day since trying to make amends, trying to save enough lives to balance the scales. Kit understood that weight now, understood what it meant to carry the knowledge that your decision, your action, your mistake had cost lives that could never be brought back. She was standing in a clearing, practicing her breathing, when she heard the sound. Soft, almost imperceptible, the crack of a twig in the tree line 200 yards to her north. Her body reacted before her mind finished processing. Drop, roll, find cover. All the training Ironside had drilled into her taking over in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The bullet hit the tree where she'd been standing, bark exploding outward in a shower of splinters. High-powered rifle, suppressed, professional shot. If she'd been half a second slower, she'd be dead. Kit's mind went cold, crystal clear. Time seemed to slow down the way it always did when death was close. She could hear her heartbeat, could feel the adrenaline flooding her system, could calculate trajectory and wind and distance and 100 other variables in the fraction of a second it took to find the shooter's position. There in the rocks, 230 yards, elevated position, good cover, smart placement. This wasn't some amateur. This was someone who knew what they were doing. She didn't have her rifle, didn't have any weapon except the knife on her belt and the training that had been beaten into her over 24 years. But she did have one advantage the shooter didn't know about. She had the eyes, and the eyes could see what was coming next. The shooter would expect her to run, to panic, to make noise and give away her position. Instead, Kit went still, perfectly, completely still, became part of the landscape the way Ironside had taught her, controlled her breathing, slowed her heartbeat, waited. 30 seconds passed, a minute, 2 minutes. The shooter would be getting nervous now, would be wondering if they'd hit her, would be trying to decide whether to stay in position or move in to confirm the kill. Movement, there. Just the slightest shift in the rocks as the shooter adjusted position, trying to get a better angle. Kit memorized the exact location. Then, moving with the kind of silence that takes years to master, she started working her way through the forest. Not toward the shooter. That's what they'd expect. Instead, she moved in a wide arc, using the terrain to stay invisible, getting into position for an approach from the blind side. It took 15 minutes. 15 minutes of moving slower than she'd ever moved in her life. Every step calculated, every movement deliberate. One sound, one mistake, and the shooter would know where she was. But Kit didn't make mistakes. Not anymore. Ironside had trained that out of her along with everything else that made her soft. When she finally had the angle she needed, she could see the shooter clearly. Male, 30s, military bearing, good equipment. This wasn't some random attack. This was a professional hit, which meant someone had sent him, someone who wanted her dead. The question was why, and that question would have to wait because right now, survival came first. Kit had learned something in her years of combat that most people never understand. The difference between killing at distance and killing up close isn't just physical, it's psychological. When you're behind a scope, there's separation. The target is just a figure, an objective. When you're close enough to see their face, to smell their fear, to hear their breathing, it becomes personal, becomes human. She preferred the distance, but she'd do what was necessary. The shooter never saw her coming. One moment they were scanning the forest through their scope. The next moment, Kit had her blade pressed against their throat and her knee driving into their spine. "Who sent you?" Her voice was calm, cold, the voice of someone who'd done this before. The shooter's answer would change everything, would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to revelations about her grandfather's death, about the old guard's secrets, about a betrayal that went back 40 years and cost hundreds of lives. But in that moment, pressed against a stranger in the Montana wilderness, Kit felt something she hadn't felt since she was a child. Fear, not of dying. She'd made peace with that possibility years ago. Fear of what the answer might mean. Fear of what truths were about to come crashing down. Fear that everything she thought she knew about her grandfather, about the old guard, about her own purpose, was built on lies. The shooter smiled, blood on their teeth. "You already know who sent me, you just don't want to admit it." And that's when Kit realized the nightmare was only beginning. What do you do when the people you trust most are the ones who betray you? The shooter's name was Daniel Cross, former Delta Force. Dishonorable discharge 3 years ago for reasons that were classified. Now working as a contractor for whoever paid the highest price. He told Kit everything after she broke his trigger finger and promised to take the rest if he didn't talk. "Webb," he'd said, choking on blood and fear. "Colonel Marcus Webb. He's the one who hired me. Said you were asking too many questions. Said you needed to be eliminated before you figured out the truth." Kit had felt something crack inside her when she heard that name. Webb, one of the old guard. One of the men who'd stood at her grandfather's grave and dropped a brass cartridge onto his coffin. One of the men Ironside had trusted with his life. "What truth?" she'd asked, her blade still pressed against his throat. "About Iraq, about Operation Phantom, about the 8 Marines who died." Cross had coughed, tried to shift position, thought better of it when the blade pressed harder. "Your grandfather didn't make a mistake that day. He was set up. Webb fed him false intelligence, made him think those coordinates were enemy positions when they were actually where our own guys were staging." The world had seemed to tilt sideways. Why? Why would Webb do that? Money, always money. Webb was running weapons to both sides, making millions off the war. But those 8 Marines, they'd figured it out, were planning to blow the whistle. So Webb eliminated them, made it look like your grandfather's mistake. Ironside took the fall, carried the guilt, never knew the truth. Kit had wanted to kill Cross right there, wanted to open his throat and watch him bleed out on the Montana soil. But she needed him alive, needed him to testify, needed him to prove what he was saying was true. She'd bound him with zip ties, called Cassidy Brennan at CIA for an extraction, then spent the next hour sitting in the clearing watching the sky change colors and trying to process what she'd just learned. Everything she thought she knew was a lie. Her grandfather hadn't made a mistake. He'd been betrayed, used, sacrificed to cover up war crimes and corruption. And he died not knowing the truth, died carrying guilt that wasn't his, died thinking he was a failure when he'd actually been a victim. The rage that burned through her then was unlike anything she'd ever felt. Pure, consuming, the kind of rage that makes people do things they can never take back. But underneath the rage was something worse, grief, because now she understood why Ironside had pushed her so hard, why he'd been so obsessed with teaching her to make the perfect shot, why he'd spent 20 years turning her into the most lethal sniper the military had ever produced. He'd known something was wrong, maybe not the details, maybe not Webb's betrayal specifically, but he'd known that the official story didn't add up, that there were pieces missing, that someone out there had gotten away with murder. And he'd been training her to finish what he couldn't, to find the truth, to make them pay. Cassidy had arrived with a team 2 hours later. They'd taken Cross into custody, secured his weapon and equipment, started the process of verifying his claims. Kit had given them everything, every detail of the conversation, then driven back to her cabin and spent the night staring at the wall, unable to sleep, unable to think about anything except her grandfather's face the last time she'd seen him alive. He'd been sick by then, the cancer eating him from the inside, but his mind had been sharp, his eyes still clear. He'd known he was dying, had called her home for one last lesson. "Kit," he'd said, his voice rough with pain and medication, "I need you to promise me something." "Anything, Grandpa. Whatever happens, whatever you learn about me after I'm gone, I need you to remember this. Every shot is a promise. You make that promise with your whole heart or you don't make it at all. There's no middle ground, no half measures. You either commit completely or you walk away." She'd promised, had held his hand while he struggled to breathe, while the cancer ate away at his lungs, while everything that made him who he was slowly dissolved. "I'm proud of you," he'd whispered, "prouder than I ever knew how to say. You're going to do great things, Kit, greater than I ever did. Just remember to forgive yourself when you miss, because you will miss. Everyone does. The measure of a warrior isn't whether they make every shot, it's whether they have the courage to take the next one." He died 3 days later, peacefully they said, in his sleep. But now Kit knew better, knew that the heart attack was convenient timing. Too convenient. Webb must have known Ironside was getting close to the truth, must have decided that even a dying man was too dangerous to leave alive. The forensics team confirmed it 4 days after Cross's capture. Potassium chloride injected between his toes where no one would think to look. It mimics a heart attack perfectly. Untraceable unless you know what to look for. Webb had murdered her grandfather, had stood at his funeral and pretended to mourn, had dropped a bullet on his coffin like some kind of twisted joke. Cassidy had wanted to bring Webb in immediately, had wanted to arrest him, interrogate him, build a case the legal way. But Kit had other ideas, ideas that scared even her with their intensity. "No," she'd said, "not yet. I want to know everything first, every detail, every lie, every person involved, then we move. Kit, this is personal for you. You're too close to it. Let the agency handle this." The agency, Kit had laughed, but there was no humor in it. The same agency that covered up Webb's crimes for 40 years. The same agency that let my grandfather die thinking he was a failure. "No, this one's mine." She'd seen the concern in Cassidy's eyes, the worry that Kit was going to cross a line she couldn't uncross, and maybe she was. Maybe that line was already behind her. Maybe it had been behind her since the first time she'd looked through a scope and ended a life. But she didn't care, not anymore. The investigation took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of pulling threads, following paper trails, connecting dots that had been deliberately obscured. What they found was worse than Kit had imagined. Webb hadn't just killed 8 Marines in Iraq. That had been one operation in a pattern that went back decades. Grenada, Panama, Desert Storm, Afghanistan, every conflict Webb had been there, running weapons, selling intelligence, getting rich off American blood while wearing the uniform and pretending to be a hero. And he hadn't worked alone. There were others, contractors, politicians, foreign agents, a whole network of people who'd profited from America's wars while soldiers died protecting their interests. Ironside had stumbled onto part of it 15 years ago, had started asking questions, had gotten too close, so they'd set him up, made him the fall guy for Operation Phantom, buried him under guilt and shame, made sure he'd never dig any deeper. But they'd made one mistake. They'd let him live, let him go home to Montana and train his granddaughter, let him pass on everything he knew to a girl who had the eyes and the skills and the will to finish what he'd started. Now that girl was coming for them, all of them. Hawk had been the one to figure out what Kit was planning, had shown up at her cabin one night, let himself in like he'd been doing since she was a child, found her cleaning her rifle with the kind of focused intensity that meant she was preparing for something big. "You're going to kill him, aren't you?" Not a question, a statement. Kit hadn't looked up from her work. "Yes." "That's not justice, Kit, that's revenge. Call it what you want. He murdered my grandfather. He murdered 8 Marines. He's been selling out this country for 40 years. Someone needs to stop him." "Someone, not you. Let the system handle it." Kit had finally looked at him then, really looked. Saw the old warrior who'd taught her to read the wind to compensate for distance, to make shots that seemed impossible. Saw the man who'd loved her grandfather like a brother, and saw something else too. Fear. The same fear she'd seen at the funeral. "You knew," she'd said softly. "You knew about Webb, you knew what he'd done." Hawk had closed his eyes. "I suspected, couldn't prove it. Your grandfather suspected too. We were trying to build a case, but he ran out of time. And you didn't tell me, didn't warn me, didn't think maybe I deserved to know that the man standing at my grandfather's grave was the one who put him there. I was trying to protect you. If I'd told you, you would have done exactly what you're about to do. You would have gone after Webb, and he would have killed you too, just like he's killed everyone else who got too close. I'm not everyone else. I'm Guardian Angel. I'm the best shot you ever trained. I'm better than you were. Better than my grandfather was. Better than anyone Webb could send after me. Skill isn't the issue, Kit. The issue is what this will cost you. You kill Webb, you become what he is, a murderer, someone who takes justice into their own hands, someone who crosses lines that can't be uncrossed." Kit had gone back to cleaning her rifle. "Those lines were crossed a long time ago. The day I made my first kill. The day I became a weapon instead of a person. You and Grandpa, you made that choice for me when I was 8 years old. You turned me into this. Don't get upset now that I'm using what you taught me." Hawk had been quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Your grandfather wouldn't want this. He'd want you to live, to find peace, to be more than just a weapon. My grandfather spent 15 years trying to make amends for a mistake he didn't make. He died carrying guilt that belonged to someone else. If he were here, if he knew the truth, he'd be loading his rifle right next to me. You know I'm right." Hawk had no answer for that, because it was true. Ironside would have wanted justice, would have demanded it, would have torn Webb apart with his bare hands if given the chance. "When?" Hawk had finally asked. 3 days, there's a weapons expo in Virginia. Webb will be there, lot of security, lot of witnesses, but also a lot of angles, a lot of positions. I've been studying the venue for 2 weeks. I know every sight line, every vantage point, every possible shot. You're going to kill him in public, in front of hundreds of people." "No, I'm going to kill him and make it look like an accident, equipment malfunction. Wrong place, wrong time. No one will ever know it was me, except Webb. In that last second he'll know, he'll see me. He'll understand why he's dying, that's what matters." Hawk had stood up, moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the handle. "Your grandfather loved you more than anything in this world. He'd be proud of what you've become, but he'd also be terrified, because he knew what it costs to carry the weight of the dead. He knew how it hollows you out, makes you into something hard and cold and alone. He didn't want that for you. Too late. I've been alone since I was 8 years old, since you and Grandpa decided to make me into a soldier instead of a person. This is who I am. This is what I do." Hawk had left without another word. Kit had finished cleaning her rifle, then spent the rest of the night planning the shot that would end Marcus Webb's life and maybe her own humanity in the process. But that was okay. She'd stopped being fully human a long time ago. Can you make a perfect shot when your hands are shaking with rage? The Weapons Expo in Virginia was exactly what Kit had expected. Massive, crowded, hundreds of defense contractors showing off their latest toys to military brass and foreign buyers. The kind of place where someone like Marcus Webb would feel comfortable, safe, surrounded by people who thought like him, who saw war as business and lives as acceptable losses. Kit had arrived 2 days early, had scouted every building, every rooftop, every window with a sight line to the convention center, had mapped wind patterns, calculated distances, identified the perfect position for the shot, a building 300 yards away, abandoned office space, easy access, clear view of the main stage where Webb would be giving a presentation on modern warfare tactics. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd brought the rifle her grandfather had given her for her 21st birthday, a custom-built M40 that he'd modified himself, better than anything the military issued, better than anything most civilian shooters ever got their hands on. He'd presented it to her in a ceremony of one, just the two of them on his ranch, and said, "This is your inheritance, Kit. Use it to protect people who can't protect themselves. Use it to make the world a little safer. Use it to keep the promises I couldn't keep." Now she was going to use it to kill one of his oldest friends, to execute a man he'd served with, trusted, loved like a brother. And the worst part was, Ironside would have understood, would have pulled the trigger himself if he'd known the truth. Kit set up her position at 400. The sun wouldn't rise for another 2 hours. The building was dark, empty, perfect. She disabled the security cameras the night before, had mapped out her escape route, had prepared for every contingency. By 600 she was in position, rifle assembled, scope calibrated, breathing controlled, heart rate steady, everything exactly as it should be. Except her hands were shaking. Not much, just the slightest tremor, the kind that most people wouldn't even notice. But through a scope at 300 yards, the slightest movement becomes magnified. A tremor becomes a miss becomes a failure. Kit closed her eyes, breathed, tried to find the stillness her grandfather had taught her, but all she could see was his face. All she could hear was his voice. "Every shot is a promise, Kit. You make that promise with your whole heart or you don't make it at all." Was this a promise, or was this revenge? Was there even a difference anymore? The expo started at 900. Kit watched through her scope as hundreds of people filed into the convention center. Military officers, government officials, contractors, all of them pretending they were there to make the world safer when really they were just there to make money off death. Webb arrived at 9:45. Kit recognized his silver hair, his distinguished bearing, the way he moved through the crowd like he owned it. Because in a way, he did. This was his world. The world of shadows and lies and profitable wars. The world he'd built on the backs of men like her grandfather. He took the stage at 1000, started his presentation, talked about modern warfare, about how to fight asymmetric conflicts, about the importance of intelligence and precision strikes. The same principles Ironside had taught her, the same principles Webb had betrayed. Kit put her eye to the scope, found Webb's center mass, adjusted for wind, adjusted for distance. The shot was perfect, clean. She could make it right now, could end him in front of everyone, could make him pay for everything he'd done. Her finger moved to the trigger, started to apply pressure. Then stopped. Because in her scope she saw something that made her breath catch. Webb wasn't alone on stage. There was someone else, a young woman, early 20s, standing off to the side, dressed in military uniform, looking nervous and proud and excited all at once. Kit zoomed in on the woman's face, read the name on her uniform, Lieutenant Sarah Webb, Marcus's granddaughter. She'd forgotten that monsters have families too, that the people you kill leave behind people who love them, people who'll grieve, people who'll carry the weight of that loss for the rest of their lives. The way Kit had been carrying the weight of her grandfather's death. Her hands started shaking harder, not from rage anymore, from something worse, doubt. If she killed Webb here now in front of his granddaughter, she'd be doing to Sarah exactly what Webb had done to her, taking away someone she loved, making her carry that grief. that anger, that need for revenge. The cycle would continue. Sarah would grow up wanting justice, would maybe become just like Kit, would maybe train herself to hunt down the person who killed her grandfather. And then what? More death, more grief, more people learning to be weapons instead of human beings. Kit's finger moved away from the trigger. This wasn't justice. Hawk had been right, this was revenge. And revenge didn't end anything. It just created more pain, more broken people, more warriors who'd lost their humanity in pursuit of payback. She started to pull back from the scope, started to break down the rifle, started to accept that maybe there was a better way to handle this. That's when the shot came. Not from Kit's rifle, from somewhere else. Another building, another shooter. The bullet hit Marcus Webb Center, Mass. He dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Blood sprayed across the stage. Sarah screamed. People started running. Chaos erupted. Kit's training took over. She swung her scope toward the source of the shot, found the position. Another rooftop, 45 degrees from her angle, professional setup. This wasn't random. This was an execution. And through her scope she saw the shooter, saw his face, recognized him. Victor Hawk. Time seemed to stop. Kit's mind refused to process what she was seeing. Hawk, the man who'd taught her everything. The man who'd stood at her grandfather's grave and dropped a bullet onto his coffin. The man who'd tried to talk her out of killing Webb. He'd beaten her to it. No, that wasn't right. This wasn't about beating her to anything. This was about protecting her. Hawk had known what killing Webb would cost Kit, had known it would destroy whatever humanity she had left. So he'd done it himself, had taken that burden, had crossed that line so she wouldn't have to. And in doing so, had sentenced himself to the same fate. Because Kit saw the police already moving toward Hawk's position, saw the security teams responding, saw the net closing, Hawk had to know this was a one-way trip, had to know he'd never make it out. He was 67 years old. His knees were bad, his reflexes slower than they used to be. This wasn't a mission he could escape from. This was suicide, a warrior's death, going out on his own terms, making one last shot count. For her, Kit's hands stopped shaking. Her mind went crystal clear. She had maybe 60 seconds before security locked down the entire area. 60 seconds to make a choice. She could pack up her rifle, walk away. Let Hawk take the fall for this. Let him die thinking he'd saved her. Or she could do what her grandfather had trained her to do. What Hawk had trained her to do. What 4 generations of Hayes warriors had always done. Keep the promise. Kit's rifle swung toward the building where Hawk was positioned. She could see him through her scope, see him looking back at her. Their eyes met across 300 yards. She saw him shake his head, saw him mouth the words, "Get out, run." But Kit wasn't running, not anymore. She'd spent her entire life learning to make the impossible shot, learning to hit targets that seemed unreachable, learning to do what no one else could do. Now she was going to prove she'd learned those lessons well. Kit's scope moved to the police team approaching Hawk's position. 6 men, armed, moving fast. They'd be on him in 30 seconds. No way Hawk could fight them all off. No way he could escape. Unless someone gave him cover. Kit's first shot took out the lead officer's radio. Not the officer, the equipment, just enough to cause confusion, to make them hesitate. Her second shot hit the door frame next to them. Warning shot, making them duck, making them think there was a second sniper. Her third shot hit the ground between them and Hawk's position, creating separation, buying time. Hawk understood immediately. She saw him move, saw him break down his rifle with the speed of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, saw him disappear from the window. Kit kept firing, kept the police pinned, kept them focused on her position instead of his. She wasn't trying to hit anyone, just trying to create enough chaos for Hawk to slip away. It worked for about 90 seconds. Then the return fire started. The police had figured out her position, had called in backup, heavy weapons, the kind designed to suppress sniper positions. Bullets tore through the walls around her. Glass shattered, concrete exploded. Kit stayed low, stayed calm, counted rounds, waited for her moment. When the firing paused for reload, she moved, grabbed her rifle, hit the stairs, 3 flights down, out the back exit, into the alley where she'd parked her motorcycle that morning. She was on the bike and moving before anyone even knew she'd left the building. 17 blocks away, she pulled into a parking garage, ditched the bike, changed clothes, became just another person on the street, anonymous, invisible. Her phone buzzed, text from an unknown number. "You were supposed to run, not save me, but thank you, H." Kit stared at the message, felt something crack inside her chest, something that had been frozen for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to be warm. She typed back, "That's what family does. We save each other, even when we're told not to." The response came immediately. "Your grandfather would be proud, I know I am. Now disappear, they'll be looking for both of us. Stay dark, stay safe, H." Kit deleted the messages, destroyed the phone, started walking. She didn't know where she was going, didn't have a plan. For the first time in her life, she was completely off script. No mission, no objective, no target. Just her, alone, with all the weight she'd been carrying and no idea what to do with it. She'd come to Virginia to kill a man, to cross a line she could never uncross, to become the weapon everyone had spent 24 years turning her into. Instead, she'd learned something her grandfather had been trying to teach her all along. Being a warrior isn't about making the kill shot. It's about knowing when not to pull the trigger. It's about protecting people even when protecting them costs you everything. It's about sacrifice that goes beyond your own survival. Webb was dead, justice was served, but not by Kit's hand, and maybe that mattered. Maybe choosing not to kill was just as important as all the time she had killed. Maybe her grandfather had known she'd face this choice. Maybe that's why he'd spent so much time teaching her about promises and costs and the weight of the dead. Maybe he'd been preparing her not just to be a weapon, but to be something more, something better. Someone who could make the hard choices and still keep their humanity intact. Kit kept walking. The sun was setting. Virginia was beautiful this time of year. She'd never really noticed before, had always been too focused on missions and targets and the next shot. Maybe it was time to start seeing the world for what it was, instead of what it could become through a scope. Her phone buzzed again. Different number, this one she recognized, Cassidy. "We need to talk. Webb wasn't alone, there are others, and they're coming for you, both of you, call me, please." Kit looked at the message for a long time, then she deleted it too. Because she already knew there were others, had known from the moment she started investigating Webb's network. One man doesn't corrupt an entire system alone. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all profiting from war, all getting rich off American blood. And they'd all just learned that someone was hunting them. Someone who'd been trained by the best. Someone who had the eyes. Someone who'd made 187 confirmed kills and was about to add more to that count. Kit Hayes was done running, done hiding, done letting evil men profit from the death of good soldiers. She was guardian angel, and she had promises to keep. Starting with the promise she'd made to her grandfather, to finish what he'd started, to make the world a little safer, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Even if it cost her everything. Especially if it cost her everything. Because that's what warriors do. They pay the price so others don't have to. How do you fight an enemy that wears the same uniform you do? The safe house was in Montana, deep in the mountains, off-grid, no digital footprint, just a cabin that had belonged to Tom Bradley before cancer took him 3 years ago. He'd left it to the old guard in his will, a place to disappear when the world got too heavy. Kit had been there for 2 weeks, planning, researching, building a list of names and faces and crimes that went back 40 years. Webb had been the tip of the iceberg. Beneath him was a network of corruption so vast it made her head spin just trying to map it all out. Contractors selling defective equipment to the military. Officers taking bribes to award contracts to the lowest bidder instead of the best. Weapons dealers running guns to both sides of conflicts. Intelligence officers selling classified information to foreign powers. Politicians getting rich off defense budgets while soldiers died with equipment that didn't work and support that never came. And all of it hidden behind flags and patriotic speeches, and the lie that they were serving their country. Hawk had shown up on the 13th day, walked through the door like he owned the place, which in a way he did. He'd been coming to this cabin for 30 years, knew every creaking floorboard, every loose window, every hiding spot Bradley had built into the structure. "You look like hell," he'd said, dropping a bag of supplies on the table. "You look worse," Kit had replied, which was true. Hawk had aged 10 years in the 2 weeks since Virginia. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed, the weight of what he'd done sitting heavy on shoulders that had carried too much for too long. "We need to talk about what comes next," Hawk had said, pulling out a chair, sitting down like his knees hurt. "I know what comes next. I keep hunting. I take down everyone on this list. I finish what Grandpa started." "And then what? You spend the rest of your life on the run, become a ghost, die alone in some foreign country because you can't ever come home. If that's what it takes." Hawk had been quiet for a long moment. Then he'd pulled something from his jacket, a letter, old, the paper yellowed with age. Kit recognized the handwriting immediately. "Your grandfather wrote this 3 days before he died," Hawk had said. "He knew something was wrong, knew his heart attack was too convenient, knew Webb or someone like him was coming. He wanted me to give this to you after everything came out, after you knew the truth." Kit had taken the letter with shaking hands, unfolded it carefully, started to read. Her grandfather's words, his final message, not to the world, just to her. "Kit, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you know what Webb did. You know about Operation Phantom. You know about the 8 Marines. You know about my 15 years of carrying guilt for a mistake I didn't make. I'm writing this because I need you to understand something. I need you to know that the reason I trained you, the reason I spent 20 years teaching you to shoot, wasn't so you could get revenge. It was so you could protect yourself. Because I knew that someday someone would figure out that you're my granddaughter, that you have the eyes, that you're dangerous to them. I knew they'd come for you, the same way they came for me, and I wanted you to be ready, to be able to defend yourself, to survive. But surviving isn't the same as living, Kit. I learned that too late. I spent 15 years surviving, carrying weight that wasn't mine to carry, trying to make amends for crimes I didn't commit. And in doing that, I forgot how to live, forgot how to be human, became just a weapon, just a tool for killing. I don't want that for you. I want you to live, really live, not just survive from one mission to the next. I want you to find peace, to find purpose beyond the rifle, to be more than what I turned you into. Yes, there are evil men in this world, men like Webb who profit from death and suffering, men who need to be stopped, but stopping them isn't your responsibility. You didn't create this mess. You shouldn't have to clean it up. Let it go, Kit. Let the anger go. Let the need for revenge go. Let me go. Live the life I never could. Find love. Find purpose. Find something worth protecting that isn't just another target through a scope. Because here's what I learned too late. Every shot is a promise, but so is every choice not to shoot. Sometimes the bravest thing a warrior can do is walk away, is choose peace over war, is choose life over death. I'm proud of you, Kit, prouder than I ever knew how to say. You're the best of us, the best of 4 generations of warriors, which means you're strong enough to do what we couldn't. You're strong enough to choose differently. I love you always. Grandpa. Kit had read the letter 3 times. Each time the words hit harder. Each time she felt the weight of them settling into her chest like stones. Her grandfather hadn't wanted this, hadn't wanted her hunting Webb's network, hadn't wanted her becoming what he'd been. He'd wanted her to walk away, to live. But how could she? How could she just let these people keep operating, keep profiting, keep killing soldiers and destroying lives? He was wrong, Kit had finally said, setting the letter down. Wrong to think I could just walk away. Wrong to think there's any choice here except to fight. Was he? Hawk had leaned back in his chair. Or was he the only one of us who finally understood that fighting isn't always the answer? That sometimes the only way to win is not to play the game. That's easy to say when you're not the one who has to live with letting them get away with it. Who says they get away with it? There are other ways to bring down corrupt systems, Kit. Legal ways. We have evidence now. We have Cross's testimony. We have documents. We could go to the Inspector General, to Congress, to the media. We could expose all of it without firing a single shot. And you think that would work? You think the same system that protected these people for 40 years is suddenly going to hold them accountable because we ask nicely? No, but I think it has a better chance than us trying to take down an entire network by ourselves. You're the best shot I ever trained, Kit. Maybe the best shot anyone ever trained, but you're still one person. They're hundreds, maybe thousands. You can't kill them all. And even if you could, what would that make you? Kit had no answer for that, because she knew what it would make her, what it was already making her, a monster, the same as the people she was hunting. Your grandfather spent 15 years trying to balance the scales, Hawk had continued. Trying to save enough lives to make up for the ones he thought he'd taken. It destroyed him, hollowed him out, made him into something hard and cold and alone. He didn't want that for you. Too late. I've been hard and cold and alone since I was 8 years old. No, you've been trained to survive. There's a difference. Training can be unlearned. Humanity can be reclaimed, but only if you choose it, only if you decide that being a weapon isn't the only option. Kit had stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the Montana mountains. The same mountains her grandfather had looked at for 50 years. The same mountains that had watched 4 generations of Hayes warriors prepare for war. What did it cost him? She'd asked quietly. All those years, all that training, all that weight. What did it cost Grandpa to be what he was? Hawk had been silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Everything. It cost him everything. His first marriage failed because he couldn't stop being a warrior long enough to be a husband. Your grandmother, his second wife, she understood him better. But even she said sometimes it felt like she was married to a ghost. Like the real Ironside had died in Korea, and what came home was just something wearing his face. He missed most of your mother's childhood because he was deployed. Missed birthdays, missed graduations, missed everything that mattered because the mission always came first. When he finally retired, tried to be present, tried to be a father instead of a warrior, it was too late. The damage was done. Your mother never forgave him for that. Never understood why the mission was always more important than his family. That's why she kept you away from him for the first 8 years of your life. Why she fought so hard to keep him from training you. But Ironside wore her down, convinced her that the world was dangerous, that you needed to know how to protect yourself, that he could teach you things that would keep you safe. And maybe he was right. Maybe the training did keep you safe, but it also cost you your childhood, your innocence, your chance to be normal. By the time you were 16, you could kill a man at 600 yards, but you couldn't have a normal relationship, couldn't connect with people your own age, couldn't trust anyone enough to let them close. That's what it cost him, Kit. That's what he gave up. And that's what he was terrified you'd give up too if you kept walking this path. Kit had pressed her forehead against the cold glass, felt tears trying to come but couldn't let them, couldn't show weakness. Even here, even alone with Hawk, the training was too deep. the control too complete. "I don't know how to be anything else," she'd whispered. "I don't know how to be normal, don't know how to stop seeing the world through a scope, don't know how to just be." Then learn the same way you learned everything else, one step at a time, one choice at a time, one day where you choose something other than the mission. "And if I can't, if I'm too broken, too far gone?" "You're not. I've known you since you were 8 years old, Kit. I've watched you grow up. I've seen you struggle with what we turned you into. And I've seen something else too. Something your grandfather saw, something that scared him and gave him hope in equal measure. You're not just a weapon, you never were, you're a person who was trained to be a weapon. There's a difference. Weapons don't doubt, don't question, don't feel guilt or grief or anything except the mission. You feel all of that. Every shot costs you something. Every kill takes a piece of your soul. That means you're still human, still savable, still capable of being something more than what we made you." Kit had turned around, looked at Hawk, really looked, saw the old warrior who'd taught her everything, who'd stood at her grandfather's grave and dropped a bullet onto his coffin, who'd killed Marcus Webb to save her from becoming a murderer. "What do I do?" she'd asked. "Where do I even start?" Hawk had smiled, sad, tired, but genuine. "You start by forgiving yourself for not being perfect, for being human, for needing help. Then you let people in. Let them see the real you, the you that exists beyond the rifle and the mission and the code. And then you do what your grandfather asked. You walk away, not forever, not permanently, just for now, just long enough to remember what you're fighting for, what's worth protecting, what's worth living for." "What about Webb's network? What about all the others?" "Leave it to people like Cassidy, people whose job is to fight corruption legally. Give them the evidence. Help them build cases. But don't make it your mission to personally destroy everyone on that list. That's a path that only leads to more death, more pain, more warriors who forgot how to be human." Kit had looked at the letter on the table, at her grandfather's final words, at the life he'd wanted for her, the life he'd never had for himself. Maybe he was right. Maybe fighting wasn't always the answer. Maybe sometimes the bravest thing a warrior could do was walk away. Choose peace over war. Choose life over death. But there was still one problem. One mission that couldn't be delegated. One promise that needed to be kept. "There's a situation," Kit had said. "Colombia, hostage crisis, 12 civilians, 4 American children. Cassidy called me 2 weeks ago. I told her I'd handle it." Hawk had nodded slowly. "One more mission, one more promise to keep, then you walk away." "Then I try to walk away. I don't know if I can. Don't know if I'm capable of being anything except what you made me. But I'll try, for Grandpa, for myself. I'll try." That's all anyone can ask. They'd sat in silence for a while. 2 warriors, 4 generations of training between them, all the weight of all the wars and all the dead pressing down on their shoulders. Finally, Kit had stood up, started packing her gear. Rifle, ammunition, medical supplies, everything she'd need for one more mission. "Kit," Hawk had said, "when you make this shot, when you save those kids, I want you to remember something. Remember what your grandfather said. Every shot is a promise, but so is every choice not to shoot. You go to Colombia, you save those hostages, but you don't become the thing you're fighting. You show restraint. You show mercy. You prove that you're more than just a weapon." "I'll try," Kit had said again. It was the best promise she could make, the only promise she had left. What does a guardian angel look like when she finally comes home? The mission in Colombia lasted 36 hours. Kit had inserted at night, made her way to the compound where the hostages were being held, and spent 6 hours mapping patrol patterns, security systems, and the exact location of each prisoner. The terrorists holding them were professionals, former military, well-trained, well-armed. They knew what they were doing. But they didn't have the eyes, and they'd never faced someone like Kit Hayes. She'd made 7 shots total, 7 men who'd threatened to execute children if their demands weren't met. 7 lives ended in silence, from positions they never saw, with a precision that seemed impossible. Each shot placed perfectly, each one dropping a target before they could raise an alarm or hurt anyone else. By the time the rescue team moved in, the compound was clear. The hostages were safe. 4 American children got to go home to their families. 8 other civilians got to see another day. And Kit Hayes got to keep one more promise. But this time, it felt different. This time, she wasn't just a weapon doing what weapons do. She was a guardian, actually protecting people who needed protecting, making choices that saved lives instead of just ending them. As she'd exfiltrated from Colombia, making her way back to the States through a series of safe houses and false identities, Kit had thought about her grandfather's letter, about Hawk's words, about the choice that had been laid out in front of her. Keep fighting and lose herself completely, or walk away and try to find something worth living for beyond the rifle. She'd made her choice before she even realized it, had made it the moment she decided not to kill Marcus Webb in Virginia, had made it when she saved Hawk instead of running, had made it when she'd read her grandfather's final words and understood what he'd been trying to tell her all along. Being a warrior isn't about killing, it's about protecting, and sometimes the person who needs protecting most is yourself. Kit had arrived back in Montana 3 days after the Columbia mission, had driven straight to her grandfather's ranch. The place had been empty since he died. Her mother hadn't wanted it, hadn't wanted anything to do with the life her father had built, so it sat vacant, waiting. Kit had walked through the house for the first time in 6 months, everything exactly as Ironside had left it. His rifle still mounted over the fireplace, his medals in a box on his desk, his journals filled with 50 years of missions and memories and the weight he'd carried. She'd found herself in his study, the place where he'd planned operations and cleaned weapons and written letters to families of men he'd lost, the place where he'd spent his final years trying to make sense of everything he'd done. On his desk was a photo she'd never seen before. Her, 8 years old, standing next to him on the rifle range, both of them smiling before the wait, before the kills, before everything that would come after. She'd picked up the photo, stared at it, tried to remember what it felt like to smile like that, to be happy, to be innocent. That's when her phone had rung. Cassidy. "Kit, we did it. The Inspector General's office just opened a full investigation into Webb's network. Based on the evidence you provided, they're looking at dozens of people. This goes all the way to the Pentagon. It's going to be the biggest corruption scandal in military history." "Good," Kit had said, meaning it. "There's more. They want you to testify. They want your first-hand account of what you found, what you witnessed. It could help bring down everyone involved." Kit had looked at the photo again, at the little girl who still believed the world was fair, who still thought heroes were real and bad guys always lost. "I'll testify," she'd said, "but then I'm done. I'm walking away from all of this." "Kit, you can't just walk away. You're too valuable, too skilled. The agency could use someone like you. We have operations that need." "No, I'm done being a weapon, done being used, done defining myself by how many people I can kill. I'm finding something else, something better, something that doesn't require me to see the world through a scope." Cassidy had been quiet for a long moment. "What will you do?" Kit had looked around the study, at 50 years of her grandfather's life, at all the choices he'd made and the weight they'd left behind. "I'm going to live," she'd said, "the way Grandpa wanted me to, the way I never learned how. I'm going to find out who Catherine Hayes is when she's not guardian angel, when she's not a warrior, when she's just herself. And if you can't, if you're too far gone, then I'll fail trying to be human instead of succeeding at being a weapon. Either way, it's better than what I've been doing." They'd talked for a few more minutes, made arrangements for the testimony, discussed security measures, All the practical details that came with bringing down a corruption network 40 years in the making. When Kit had hung up, she'd walked outside, stood in the same spot where her grandfather had taught her to shoot, where she'd spent thousands of hours learning to be perfect, learning to never miss, learning to be exactly what everyone needed her to be. The sun was setting, Montana sky on fire with orange and purple and red, beautiful in a way she'd forgotten to notice, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with missions or targets or the next shot. She'd thought about the promises she'd made, the ones she'd kept and the ones she'd broken, the people she'd saved and the people she'd killed, the weight of 187 lives ended by her hand, the weight of hundreds more saved. Did it balance? Did saving lives make up for taking them? Was there even an answer to that question, or was it something every warrior had to figure out for themselves? Maybe that's what her grandfather had been trying to tell her, that there is no balance, no way to make the scales even, no perfect answer, just choices, every day, every moment, choosing what kind of person to be, what kind of warrior, what kind of human. And maybe that was okay. Maybe perfection was the wrong goal. Maybe the goal was just to keep trying, to keep making choices, to keep moving forward even when you didn't know if you were doing the right thing. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Hawk. I heard about Colombia, heard you got all the hostages out, no casualties. That was the mission. The mission was to save the kids. You saved everyone. That's not following orders. That's being better than the mission required. Grandpa taught me to always do more than what's asked. He taught you a lot of things. I'm glad you're finally listening to the right lessons. Kit had smiled, actually smiled, first time in weeks, maybe months. What are you going to do now? Same thing you are. Figure out who I am when I'm not hunting people. It's been so long I'm not sure I remember, but I figure it's worth finding out. We could help each other. Two old warriors trying to learn how to be civilians. I'd like that a lot. They'd made plans to meet, to support each other through the transition, to remember together what it was like to be human instead of weapons. When Kit hung up, the sun had finished setting. Stars were coming out. Same stars her grandfather had looked at for 50 years. Same stars that had watched 4 generations of Hayes warriors go to war. But maybe that cycle was ending. Maybe she could be the one who broke it, who chose differently, who proved that warriors could also be healers, that people trained to kill could also protect, that weapons could become guardians. She walked back into the house, to her grandfather's study, to the photo of the 8-year-old girl who still believed in heroes. I'm going to try, Grandpa, she whispered to the empty room. I don't know if I can do what you wanted, don't know if I can ever be normal, but I'm going to try, for you, for Hawk, for myself, for that little girl in the photo who deserves better than what we turned her into. The room was silent, but Kit felt something, like a presence, like her grandfather was there, listening, understanding, forgiving all the things she thought needed forgiving. She picked up his journals, all 50 years of them, started reading, not the mission reports, the other parts, the parts where he wrote about his doubts and fears and the weight of command, the parts where he was just a man trying to do right in a world that didn't make it easy. She read all night, and in those pages she found something she'd been looking for without knowing it: permission, permission to be imperfect, permission to fail, permission to try and fall short and try again anyway. Her grandfather hadn't been a perfect warrior. He'd made mistakes, had carried guilt, had struggled with the same questions Kit struggled with, but he'd kept trying, kept choosing to be better, kept fighting to protect what mattered even when it cost him everything. That was the real lesson, not how to make the perfect shot, but how to keep going when the shots you make aren't perfect, how to live with the weight, how to carry the dead without letting them bury you. As the sun rose on a new day, Kit closed the final journal, made herself coffee in her grandfather's kitchen, sat on his porch and watched Montana wake up. Somewhere out there were still corrupt officers, still weapons dealers, still people profiting from war. The fight wasn't over. The battle to expose them would take years, maybe decades. But it wasn't her fight anymore. Not alone, not as guardian angel. She'd given the evidence to people whose job it was to fight corruption legally, would testify when they needed her, would help however she could. But she wouldn't define herself by it, wouldn't make it her whole identity, wouldn't forget that there was more to life than missions and targets and the next shot. She was Catherine Hayes, granddaughter of Ironside, student of Hawk, trained warrior, guardian angel. But also just a person, someone trying to find her way, someone learning to live instead of just survive, someone who'd made 187 confirmed kills and saved hundreds of lives and was now trying to figure out what came next. The answer, she was starting to realize, was whatever she chose, whatever she made of it, whatever promises she decided to keep and which ones she decided to let go. Her phone buzzed one last time. Message from an unknown number. Every shot is a promise, Kit, but remember, so is every new day, every choice to keep going, every moment you choose to live instead of just exist. I'm proud of you. Always was, always will be. Grandpa. Kit stared at the message, knew it wasn't really from him. Couldn't be. He was dead, buried in Montana soil next to Hawk and Bradley and Sullivan and all the other warriors who'd fought their wars and earned their rest. But maybe it didn't matter if it was real or just her imagination. Maybe what mattered was that she heard it, believed it, let herself feel it. She was loved, she was valued, she was more than just a weapon. And maybe, just maybe, she could learn to believe that about herself. Kit stood up, walked to her truck, loaded her grandfather's rifles into cases, not to use, just to preserve, to remember, to honor what they'd meant and what they'd cost. Then she drove into town, to the VA hospital where she'd volunteered sometimes between deployments, to the place where broken warriors went to try to heal, to try to put themselves back together. She walked through the doors, found the coordinator, said the words she never thought she'd say. I'm here to help, whatever you need. I'm not deploying anymore. I'm staying, I'm here. And for the first time in 24 years, Catherine Hayes felt like she'd finally come home. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. Sometimes it doesn't need to prove anything or make any grand gestures. Sometimes it simply acts, simply chooses, simply says yes to life even when death has been the only answer for so long. Every shot is a promise. But so is every breath, every heartbeat, every morning you wake up and choose to keep going. Kit Hayes had kept a lot of promises, to her country, to her grandfather, to the people she'd protected and the missions she'd completed. Now it was time to keep one more. The promise to herself. To live really live. To be more than guardian angel. To be human. And that promise she would keep for the rest of her life.